Picture this, it's May 1945, and you're standing on the flight deck of the legendary USS Enterprise deep in the unforgiving Pacific. The air boss has just unleashed 30 Hellcats and dauntless dive bombers, a thunderous spearhead screaming towards Japanese positions. They'll be back in 2 hours. Low on fuel, some shot to hell, pilots bone-weary and running on fumes. And here, in this moment of triumph, lies the deadly silent killer that's about to claim some of them your flight deck. It's an 8-7 2-foot-long parking lot with precisely one way in and one way out. Every carrier in World War II operated like a macabre game of musical chairs. When those battle-scarred planes returned, they had to land one by excruciating one catch-a-wire, then immediately taxi forward to park near the bow. Sounds simple, right? It wasn't. Each landing devoured an agonizing 90 seconds, and you had 30 planes circling overhead with maybe 20 minutes of fuel left. Do the math, that's 45 minutes of recovery time for 30 aircraft. The last planes in the pattern were landing on pure hope, watching their fuel gauges plummet towards empty. And if one pilot missed the wires, if one crash erupted, everything stopped. The deck crew frantically pushed wreckage overboard, while 29 other pilots burned precious fuel circling in the sky, watching disaster unfold below. But the real nightmare wasn't just the recovery time, it was the terrifying paralysis that followed. Once all your planes were aboard, they sat wingtip to wingtip from bow to stern, fully armed, fully fueled. Your flight deck looked like a crowded parking garage overflowing with bombs and aviation gas. Want to launch another strike, you couldn't. Not until deck crews manhandled every single aircraft around, RESP spotting them for launch, which devoured another soul-crushing hour. The carrier was essentially useless for 60 to 90 minutes after recovering aircraft. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force, 58 inches, 1,944, branded this the deck cycle problem, and it was strangling American naval air power. His carriers, theoretically capable of operating 100 aircraft each, could only launch one major strike per day. This wasn't a weapon, it was an incredibly expensive sitting duck. So how did Navy pilots start landing backwards to solve this deadly problem and double carrier strike power? Keep watching to find out, and make sure to like, subscribe and share this story of a revolution that changed naval warfare forever. The straight deck design wasn't anyone's fault. It was simply the standard for every Navy building carriers from the 1,922 onward. The inherent need for a long, clear runway pointing into the wind for both launch and recovery went unquestioned, primarily because no one had conceived of a better alternative. However, the true cost of this design became tragically apparent, as pilot casualties mounted not from enemy fire, but from fuel starvation while waiting to land on their own ships. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, fundamentally reshaped naval thinking about carrier warfare, though not in the way many remember. While Pearl Harbor dramatically demonstrated the devastating power projection capabilities of carriers, what transpired after the attack exposed a critical ignored flaw. Admiral Nagumo's 6 Japanese carriers launched 353 aircraft in 2 waves. By 10 a.m., with the last planes recovered, his decks were so congested that a crucial third strike against Pearl's oil storage and repair facilities couldn't be launched. His staff required 3 hours to clear, rearm, and respot the decks, a delay that would have left his task force dangerously vulnerable had any U.S. carriers been in port. Nagumo therefore retreated, leaving the mission unfinished because his flight decks had become glorified parking lots. The Americans learned this lesson brutally 6 months later at Midway. On June 4, 1942, the Japanese carriers Akagi Kaga and Soryu were caught with their decks in disarray, some planes being armed for a land strike, others rearmed for a naval strike, and recovered Zeros refueling. This deck cycle paralyzed them for 47 crucial minutes. It was during this paralysis that Wade McCluskey's dive bombers from USS Enterprise arrived, destroying 3 carriers in just 5 minutes, because they physically couldn't get planes airborne. The straight deck design had transformed them into floating bombs. Post-Midway, both navies began meticulously tracking what they termed deck cycle efficiency, essentially the duration a carrier remained useless between strikes. The figures were stark. USS Yorktown's air group averaged 93 minutes from the last recovery to the next launch during the Guadalcanal campaign in late 1942, while Saratoga logged 108 minutes during the Battle of Santa Cruz. The Japanese fared even worse, with Shokaku needing 2 hours and 14 minutes to turn her deck around after recovering aircraft at the Eastern Solomons. Every admiral in the Pacific recognized the problem. Carriers spent more time shuffling aircraft than actively fighting. Commander Wade McCluskey, the same pilot who bombed 3 Japanese carriers at Midway, authored a classified memo in January 1943 bluntly stating, "We're built for one-punch fights, but we're in a 15-round boxing match." He posited that in a clash between Japanese and American carrier groups, the side that launched first would likely win, as the other would be trapped in recovery operations when the attack arrived. Naval warfare had devolved into quick-draw contests. By mid-1943, the U.S. Navy possessed enough new Essex-class carriers to implement a rotation strategy, some launching, some recovering, some rearming. This offered a partial solution, but it necessitated 3 carriers to accomplish a task that ideally one should have handled. Commander Joseph Clifton, serving on USS Lexington in 1944, noted in his log during the Battle of the Philippine Sea that American carriers launched 226 aircraft, but took 97 minutes to recover them all with 5 pilots, ditching due to fuel exhaustion while awaiting deck space. This was clearly unsustainable. A fundamental change was imperative, especially as the U.S. Navy built larger, faster carriers capable of housing 80, then 90, then 100 aircraft. Yet, if these planes couldn't be effectively utilized due to an antiquated deck geometry from 1925, what was the purpose? While American carriers were slugging it out in the Pacific, the Royal Navy was quietly addressing the deck cycle problem in the Atlantic, largely unnoticed. British carriers faced a different set of challenges: smaller flight decks, more cramped hangars, and operations in the unpredictable North Atlantic, where harsh weather could ground aircraft for days. Captain Matthew Slattery of HMS Illustrious realized in early 1943 that his ship could never achieve American carrier efficiency using conventional straight-deck operations. He began experimenting with a seemingly audacious concept: what if planes could land while other aircraft remained parked forward on the deck? Initial tests in March 1943 were rudimentary. Slattery had his crews paint a white line down the port side, creating a narrow landing strip that bypassed parked aircraft. Pilots would approach from the stern catch, arresting wires on this offset path, then taxi into the pack. It worked precisely once before. A Seafire veered too far right and clipped the tail of a parked swordfish. It was back to the drawing board, but Slattery had validated a crucial point. The entire deck width wasn't necessarily required for landing. Aircraft could in theory touch down on one section, while another section managed different operations. The true breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Dennis Campbell, a civilian physicist working for the Royal Aircraft Establishment. In late 1943, while studying aircraft carrier efficiency for the Admiralty, Campbell realized everyone was approaching the problem incorrectly. Carriers were treating the flight deck like a highway, a single lane, one direction with everyone queuing up. But what if it were conceptualized as a railway junction where trains could cross paths if the tracks intersected at an angle? Applied to a carrier deck, angling the landing area away from the launch area would suddenly allow 2 operations to occur simultaneously. Campbell's January 1944 proposal advocated cutting the aft section of the flight deck at a 5-degree angle to port. Planes would land on this angled section, catch the wires, then taxi off to the portside deck park, while aircraft spotted on the starboard bow could launch without delay. The Admiralty was initially skeptical. Altering the fundamental geometry of every carrier based on a physicist's sketch seemed reckless. However, they approved a trial on HMS Triumph, a light carrier operating in the Indian Ocean, where combat intensity was lower. Commander H.P. Bramwell oversaw the modifications in Colombo Harbour in August 1944. Workers simply painted an angled landing strip on Triumph's deck without any structural changes, just paint and repositioned arresting wires. The first test pilot, Lieutenant Commander Eric Brown, later recounted that approaching the angled deck felt inherently wrong, like landing on a carrier that was turning beneath you. Yet it worked. Brown taxied left, and was clear of the landing area in 45 seconds. Concurrently, a Corsair launched from the bow catapult. 2 operations, same moment, 0 interference. The Royal Navy discreetly tested angled deck operations through late 1944 and into 1945. The results were notable but limited. The 5-degree angle helped but wasn't sufficient to truly separate landing and launch operations, as planes still had to taxi through congested areas. The war concluded before the British could refine the concept further, and with Japan defeated, carrier innovation abruptly ceased being a priority. The research gathered dust in Admiralty files while the world demobilized. The solution proven in combat was largely forgotten. Enter Commander Walter Boone, a U.S. Navy test pilot who in 1951 was likely weary of pronouncements that jets would render carriers obsolete. The new F-9F Panthers and F-2H Banshees were faster and heavier than propeller planes, demanding more deck space for landing and offering narrower fuel margins. Every aviation expert proclaimed the incompatibility of jet aircraft and straight-deck carriers, suggesting the Navy would either need entirely new ships or accept the end of carrier aviation. Boone dismissed this as nonsense. He had reviewed the British reports on HMS Triumph's angled deck experiments, primarily because few others had bothered and recognized what the Royal Navy had overlooked. A 5-degree angle was insufficient. The landing strip needed to be angled far enough so that a plane missing all arresting wires could simply throttle up and take off again without hitting anything. The British had focused on traffic management. Boone considered physics and failure modes. If the deck were angled 8 to 10 degrees a bolter, a pilot missing, the wires could execute a touch and go climb out and come around for another attempt. No crash, no deck crew clearing wreckage, no 30 planes circling while a disaster was contained. In March 1951, Boone pitched this idea to Rear Admiral Apollo Soucek at the Naval Air Test Center in Patuxent River, Maryland. Soucek's response was, in essence, prove it. So Boone and his team utilized USS Midway during her routine maintenance in Norfolk. They painted an angled landing area on her deck offset 8 degrees to port and repositioned the arresting gear. This simple geometric alteration held revolutionary implications. The angled deck created 2 distinct runways on a single ship, a straight catapult track from bow to stern for launches, and an angled landing strip from stern to port side, midship for recoveries. For the first time in naval aviation history, simultaneous landing and launching became possible. The inaugural test occurred in July 1951, with Boone himself flying the initial approach in an F-9F Panther, coming in at 145 knots toward what appeared to be a deck turning away from him. He executed a perfect trap on the 3-wire taxied to the portside deck park. While he was still rolling, another Panther launched from the bow catapult. 30 seconds later, a third Panther trapped on the angled deck, followed by another launch, then a recovery, a launch, a recovery, a launch. Flight operations that once consumed 90 minutes were now happening in a continuous flow. The test crew logged 12 landings and 12 launches in just 18 minutes, an evolution that would have taken over an hour on a straight deck. But what truly solidified the concept was Boone's deliberate bolter during the 7th approach, intentionally missing all 4 wires. On a straight deck, this would be an emergency, likely resulting in a collision with parked aircraft, millions of dollars in damage and potential fatalities. On the angled deck, Boone simply added throttle, lifted off, and climbed away cleanly. The deck crew didn't even flinch. He circled and trapped on the next pass. Soucek, observing from the island, immediately grasped the profound significance. The angled deck didn't merely enhance efficiency. It eliminated the deadliest failure mode in carrier aviation. The July tests validated the geometry, and the August tests confirmed its efficacy with multiple aircraft types. By September 1951, the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics was already drafting plans to retrofit every carrier in the fleet. 1 test pilot and a can of paint had just doubled American naval striking power. Proving the angled deck worked with paint on USS Midway's flight deck was one matter. Actually rebuilding carriers to make it permanent was an engineering nightmare that would span 3 years, consume hundreds of millions of dollars, and force the Navy to re-evaluate every aspect of carrier construction. The challenge wasn't just cutting the deck at an angle, but that every carrier system had been designed around straight deck geometry for 30 years. Altering one component necessitated changing everything. The first hurdle was the island superstructure. On straight deck carriers, the island was positioned midship on the starboard side, which was acceptable when the landing area ran straight down the centerline. However, with an 8-degree angled deck, recovering aircraft were now flying directly at the island before catching wires. The approach path intersected precisely where the island stood. Naval architects at the New York Naval Shipyard spent 6 months in late 1951 deliberating whether to move, shrink, or somehow render islands transparent to aircraft. The eventual solution was a compromise, shifting the island slightly aft and adding a deck extension on the port side to widen the angled landing area. This required cutting into the hull structure and reinforcing frame members. Every carrier retrofit would demand 4 months in dry dock solely for structural work. The second challenge involved the arresting gear itself. The hydraulic systems designed to stop aircraft were engineered to run perpendicular to the ship's centerline, with wire machinery integrated into the deck structure. Angling everything by 8 degrees meant redesigning the entire arresting system, rerouting hydraulic lines, and rebuilding the below-deck spaces housing the equipment. Grumman aircraft engineer Robert Decker estimated that each carrier retrofit would entail removing and replacing approximately 40% of the arresting gear infrastructure. USS Antietam's conversion in 1952 alone required 1,000 man-hours solely for arresting system work. Then came the catapult problem, which serendipitously transformed into an opportunity. The Navy had been testing steam catapults significantly more powerful than the older hydraulic systems, and the angled deck retrofit provided the perfect justification for their installation. Commander C. Kirkpatrick, overseeing Antietam's conversion, recognized that steam catapults on the bow, coupled with angled deck landings, meant carriers could launch heavier aircraft while simultaneously recovering other heavy aircraft. However, installing steam catapults required cutting deck plates, running steam lines from the boilers, and constructing below-deck catapult machinery rooms. What began as a deck angle project evolved into a complete flight deck reconstruction. The mirror landing system, the optical device designed to guide pilots to the angled deck, presented its own set of difficulties. British inventors had developed the system in 1952, employing a gyro-stabilized mirror and lights to indicate the pilot's glide slope. Its installation demanded precise calibration to the new 8-degree deck angle, and the mirror had to be positioned where pilots could see it during the offset approach. Lieutenant Commander J.R. Lamb, the test pilot, evaluating the system on Antietam, crashed twice during early testing because the mirror's initial placement provided erroneous glide slope information. They had to relocate it 3 times before achieving accuracy. Between 1952 and 1955, the Navy converted 13 Essex-class carriers to angled decks. Each conversion cost between $8 and $12 million, a significant sum, considering the ships themselves cost $70 million new. USS Bennington entered Norfolk Naval Shipyard in January 1954 and didn't re-emerge until September. USS Hornet's retrofit took 7 months. These were not minor modifications. Workers were cutting away sections of the original deck, welding new structures, and rerouting every major system. The ships that emerged were fundamentally different from those that entered, even if they appeared largely similar from a distance. USS Antietam departed Norfolk in December 1952 as the world's first operational angled deck carrier, heading directly into combat in Korea, to prove whether Boone's geometry would hold up under fire or simply collapse, as another promising idea. The Navy's leadership was divided, half convinced this represented the future of naval aviation, half certain it was an expensive modification that would get pilots killed. Antietam had 4 months to settle the argument. The ship arrived off the Korean coast in January 1953, and immediately commenced combat sorties against North Korean and Chinese positions. Commander William Sisko, the air boss, kept meticulous logs, knowing Washington was closely monitoring. The first week of operations established baseline numbers. Antietam launched and recovered 68 sorties in a 12-hour period. This may not sound impressive until compared to her sister ship USS Kearsarge operating with a straight deck 50 miles south, which managed only 39 sorties in the same time frame. Same air group size, same aircraft types, same mission profiles. The angled deck was generating 74% more combat power from the same ship. The true impact emerged in what pilots termed deck availability, the percentage of time the flight deck was actually ready to receive aircraft. On straight-deck carriers in Korea, deck availability averaged 42%. This meant pilots launching for strikes knew they had a near 50/50 chance the deck would be ready upon their return. Otherwise, they'd burn fuel, circling, or divert to an emergency field in South Korea. On Antietam, with the angled deck availability surged to 79%, pilots could count on coming home. This may seem like a statistics game until you're the pilot watching your fuel gauge. Lieutenant James Michener, the future author, was flying F-9F Panthers off Antietam in February 1953 when he witnessed the angled deck save 3 lives in one afternoon. A Sky Raider, returning from a close air support mission, sustained battle damage and came in dangerously fast, boltering through all 4 wires. On a straight deck, he would have ploughed into the deck park, likely killing himself and destroying several parked aircraft. On Antietam's angled deck, he simply flew off the port side, climbed out, dumped fuel to reduce weight, and trapped on the next pass. The same day, a different emergency. An F-9F with hung ordnance, a bomb that wouldn't release, needed to land immediately because the arming wire had pulled, rendering the bomb live. Straight deck, no chance, too dangerous, with planes parked forward. Angled deck, land him now. No problem, the landing area is clear. A third incident involved a pilot with spatial disorientation who came in significantly off the centerline, touching down almost on the port deck edge. On a straight deck, he would have crashed into the island. On the angled deck, he was actually close to being on glide and trapped normally. By March 1953, Sisko's logs indicated Antietam was flying 89 sorties per day versus 47 for straight-deck carriers. The Navy dispatched Captain John Crommelin to observe operations and report back. His cable to the Chief of Naval Operations was blunt. Angled deck increases striking power by minimum 85%. Every carrier not modified is fighting at half capacity. Recommend emergency conversion of all fleet carriers immediately. The skeptics in Washington were silenced swiftly. What ultimately convinced everyone was a single metric the Navy began tracking in April: mission effectiveness cycles, which measured how many complete strike recovery, rearm, and relaunch cycles a carrier could execute in 24 hours. Straight-deck carriers averaged 2.3 cycles. Antietam was logging 4.1 cycles. She was fighting like 2 carriers. The geometry Boone had proven with paint in 1951 was now unequivocally proven with blood and bombs in 1953. The combat results from Korea ended the debate. By late 1953, the Navy committed to something far grander than merely retrofitting old carriers. They began designing a completely new class, built from the keel up around angled deck operations. The Forrestal-class supercarriers would be the first warships in history where the angled deck wasn't an afterthought modification but the foundational design principle. Everything else, propulsion, armor, weapons, crew quarters, was engineered to maximize the capabilities that 8-degree angle could deliver. USS Forrestal herself launched in December 1954, and the difference was immediately apparent just by observing her from the pier. The angled landing area wasn't painted lines on a straight deck. It was integrated into the hull structure with reinforced deck plating along the angled section specifically rated for jet aircraft impacts. The island was positioned farther aft than any previous carrier, providing pilots an unobstructed approach to the angled deck. 4 steam catapults, 2 on the bow, 2 on the angled waist deck, meant Forrestal could launch 4 aircraft every 60 seconds, while simultaneously recovering aircraft on the landing area. The theoretical maximum sortie rate was 170 aircraft per day. No World War II carrier had managed more than 90. Captain Roy Johnson took Forrestal through shakedown operations in 1955, and the ship immediately validated every design decision. During one test evolution off the Virginia Capes in August, the Air Wing launched a 40-plane strike, recovered 32 aircraft from the previous mission, and launched another 20-plane combat air patrol, all within 47 minutes. The deck crew was conducting 3 separate operations simultaneously: catapult launches from the bow arrested, recoveries on the angled deck, and aircraft towing and fueling in the forward deck park. It was controlled chaos that remarkably worked because the geometry kept everything separated. The strategic implications struck the Soviet Union like a hammer. Their naval planners had assumed American carriers were vulnerable during flight operations. Catch them while launching or recovering, and you could overwhelm them. The angled deck Forrestals obliterated that assumption. These carriers were never truly vulnerable because they were never truly stopped. Soviet Admiral Sergei Gorshkov wrote in a 1956 assessment that NATO carrier groups built around Forrestal-class ships could maintain continuous strike capability against Soviet positions. His conclusion was bleak. The Soviet surface navy had no effective counter to supercarriers that could launch 100 combat sorties per day indefinitely. The numbers substantiated Gorshkov's fears. By 1959, the Navy had 4 Forrestal-class carriers: Operational Forrestal, Saratoga Ranger, and Independence. Each carried an air wing of 90 aircraft and could generate sustained sortie rates that collectively matched 3 World War II carriers. During NATO exercises in 1960, Forrestal's air wing flew 147 sorties in 24 hours, including night operations. A key factor was aircraft availability. On straight-deck carriers, maintainers struggled to work on planes because the deck was constantly cycling between launch and recovery. On Forrestal, the forward deck park became a stable maintenance area, where crews could actually service aircraft while operations continued around them. The doctrinal shift this enabled was profound. Before angled decks, carrier groups remained far from threats because they needed time and space to recover aircraft between strikes. Forrestal and her sisters could operate closer to enemies because they could defend themselves while attacking, launching fighters while recovering strike aircraft while fueling the next wave. Vice Admiral John McCain Jr. termed it rolling thunder capability in a 1961 brief, and he meant it literally. The carrier transformed into a platform for continuous, uninterrupted air power projection in a way that had never before existed. One innovation, one geometry change, had created a weapon system that would dominate naval warfare for the next 50 years.